So the session's recording now. And the hand raising option, David Hawking is going to, Councillor Hawking is going to act as moderator for this session. So if you, when we get to the conversation part of the session, if you could use the chat or raise hand would be good. David will be looking, I'll be looking as well. That's great. We will have a second climate conversation 2 weeks from today on transportation. So just keep that in mind. We'll probably reiterate that point at the end of the session. And I think that's it for now. I'm going to pass it over to Councillor Hawking. As I say, this initiative, this series of two, the ecosystem, nature and ecosystem and transportation. The idea for this is spurred from Metro Vancouver's Climate 2050 and the discussion papers that have come out of that initiative. And the Climate Action, Environment and Climate Action Advisory Committee, many members are here today at this discussion, and Councillor Hawking and Councillor Nicholson sit on that committee. And so, yeah, we all welcome everybody here today. And David Hawking is going to do a bit of introductions to our Metro representatives that are with us today. And then we'll have a short presentation from Edward Nicol from Metro Vancouver, and then we want to open the floor and have a great discussion. So I'll pass it over to David now. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Bonnie. I'll give a brief contextual introduction, just sort of explain where we are and where Metro Vancouver is and how this fits into our overall work. So many of you probably know Bowen Island Municipality has its own climate action targets and strategy. And I've put the link in the chat. You can go have a look at if you want. Our target is zero emissions by 2050, which aligns with the latest climate science. But that's obviously an extremely challenging target. And it's something with our limited jurisdiction and resources we can't do just by ourselves. So we need to work with others. And the good news is that Metro Vancouver also has set the same target and is in the process of developing a strategy. And the discussion papers, the one that we're looking at today, is part of the engagement with the public and to help develop what they're calling the roadmaps, the plan to how to get to zero emissions by 2050. And recognizing that this is a heck of a challenge, they wanted to make sure that they're getting the public on side. And so that's why they're presenting these discussion papers. They're on all of the main issue areas, things like industry, agriculture, and so on, but there are two that really relate to Bowen Island. The one we're looking at today, nature and ecosystems, and then also transportation, which we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks, as Bonnie mentioned. So what's really important here is that we look at what Metro Vancouver is proposing in terms of this discussion paper, and we look at that. Okay, what do we think? Does that work for us? Could that relate to Bowen Island? Is there anything missing? And so when Edward gives his presentation, he'll ask the questions like that at the end. But there's also a feedback form. I've put a link to the Nature and Ecosystems discussion paper on the Metro Vancouver website. If you go to that, you'll see that there's a feedback form which asks the same questions. You know, what's missing? Is this good? Is this bad? And so on. Okay, so I think with that intro, I can just pass it over. I'm going to let Edward introduce himself because he's got a slide that actually tells you who he is and what he does. But I see that John Linder has also joined us, and John is from Metro Vancouver. So I'm just going to, because John is not giving the presentation, but he will be there to answer questions. John, can you just give a quick intro as to, I know you're involved in the climate committee or you work for the climate change group. Perhaps you could just say a word or two.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Hawking. So my name is John Lidner. I'm an air quality planner in the Air Quality and Climate Change group at Metro Vancouver. And so I'm one of the project managers for the development of Climate 2050. I'm working on a subset of it called the Clean Air Plan. And I'll be the one giving the presentation in 2 weeks on transportation. Okay. But I'll mostly turn this over to Edward to answer the questions, but I can sort of answer any broader questions about how it relates to some of the other issue areas or any other questions you might have on the process that we're following to try to develop these plans and these actions.
Great, thanks so much, John. Okay, so Edward, let's turn it over to you and introduce yourself and fire away, please.
Great, thanks very much, David. And at this point, I might just share my screen and just try and load this presentation up here. And so I'm hopeful that that is working for everyone's screen there.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So yes, my name is Edward Nicol. I'm a regional planner on the Regional Planning and Housing Services Group here at Metro Vancouver. Really excited to be a part of this climate conversation here today. And the purpose of this presentation, as David mentioned, is really just to give a bit of an overview of our Climate 2050 process, but really to try and dig into the nature and ecosystems issue area specifically, and the discussion paper that was released towards the end of May of this year, and really just sort of test how some of those ideas and concepts land from a Bowen Island perspective. And my role on this particular issue area and discussion paper is the co-lead for the nature and ecosystems issue area. In terms of the presentation today, I'll just start by giving a brief introduction to Metro Vancouver as an organization before touching on Climate 2050 and the process involved with developing that regional climate action strategy. I'll then move into some of the more specific content related to the nature and ecosystems discussion paper, touching on some of the opportunities and challenges associated with considering nature and ecosystems as part of the climate change solution. And I'll then dive into some of the more specific goals, actions, and big ideas that are put forward as part of the discussion paper itself. So Metro Vancouver is a federation of 21 municipalities, 1 electoral area, and 1 treaty First Nation. Metro Vancouver provides essential services to its members. So for example, through the provision of drinking water and sewage services. We also provide a political forum for our members, and we also help to plan for the future for this region. And one of the ways that we're looking to do that is through the development of Climate 2050, which is our regional climate action strategy for the next 30 years. And in the fall of 2018, Metro Vancouver released a Climate 2050 strategic framework, which was adopted by the board that year. And this strategic framework really laid out a specific vision for Metro Vancouver as it relates to climate change. And that vision entailed that Metro Vancouver will demonstrate bold leadership in responding to climate change by, number 1, pursuing the carbon neutral region by the year 2050, so more of a GHG reduction component, and number 2, by ensuring that our infrastructure, our ecosystems, and our communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change. So more of an adaptation or resilience component to this vision. So both of those 2 components together. And in order to reach that ultimate vision of a carbon neutral region by 2050 and a resilient region by 2050, we're aiming to release a series of roadmaps as the ultimate deliverable for Climate 2050. And as David mentioned, these roadmaps are organized thematically by different issue areas. And these roadmaps are going to contain the goals, the actions, the strategies, and the implementation metrics that really help to chart our progress and really guide us to that carbon neutral and resilient region by the year 2050. And the focus of this particular discussion paper and this presentation today is tailored to the nature and ecosystems issue area. In terms of where we are in this process, you can see on the far right, the ultimate direction here is to develop a series of roadmaps. That's sort of the end goal. In order to get to that process, what we've developed is a series of discussion papers to really seed some of the draft ideas and directions that we might want to move forward with as part of the roadmaps. And that really is where we're at today, is this idea generation phase. And as part of the engagement, getting some initial feedback on some of those early ideas. And so the next stage for us, for many of the roadmaps, is to then develop sort of a list of actions and consider what components will actually go into the ultimate plan or the roadmaps as the final stage. And so for the remainder of the slides, I'm just going to touch on the main components within the nature and ecosystems discussion paper. So this is the 6th discussion paper to be released. We do have discussion papers available for buildings, industry, transportation, waste, and agriculture, and those are all available on our website. But for the remainder of these slides, I'd really like to dig into some of the key content that we put forward as part of the Nature and Ecosystems discussion paper. So part of the early stages of the discussion paper was really to lay out some of the fundamental concepts that we really wanted to establish when we're talking about this particular issue area. And one of those fundamental concepts is this idea of green infrastructure. And when we talk about green infrastructure, what we're really referring to is sort of three subsets here. One is natural assets, one is more of enhanced assets, and the other is more of engineered assets. And so when we talk about natural assets, that's when we're really thinking about some of the more pristine areas that are sort of mostly untouched from human development, things like wetlands, forests, parks, some of our water courses like rivers, creeks, and even our fields and our soils. We also have enhanced assets, which are natural ecosystems that are functioning in somewhat of a disturbed or more of an urbanized environment. So something like rain gardens or bioswales, the trees that are in our urban parks and our urban environment. And we also have engineered assets, which are essentially engineered solutions that sort of mimic the function of natural ecosystems. So we can think about permeable pavement or green roofs as maybe it's more of an engineered asset that's really functioning similar to a more natural asset might in terms of absorbing stormwater and floodwater in excess precipitation. And these different types of green infrastructure are really important in terms of the climate conversation because they really lead to opportunities for co-benefits. And we know that the region's natural environment has tremendous inherent cultural and spiritual value. We know that these forms of green infrastructure really contribute to the region's livability, to sense of place, and it's really hard to put a price or a value on that. But we also recognize that the natural environment provides us with ecosystem services or specific benefits for humans free of charge. And you might notice in this schematic on the right-hand side here, many of these ecosystem services are specific to climate change. So for example, some of these ecosystems can store carbon, control flooding, provide shading, clean the air, and provide other related human health and well-being benefits. And so I think when we're talking about nature and ecosystems and why it's relevant to focus on as an issue area, it really comes down to a lot of the co-benefits that some of these solutions provide. And this leads us to another fundamental concept in the paper, which is this idea of nature-based solutions. And so this term, what it means is that we have actions that protect and manage and restore our ecosystems, but also are addressing some of the broader societal challenges that we're facing, including climate change. And so this is an example of a potential foreshore enhancement project in the city of Surrey. A project like this may have inherent biodiversity benefits and benefit the natural environment, but this is also the type of action that can really help this coastal area adapt to a changing climate, specifically to sea level rise and coastal storms. So again, it's a solution that's providing multiple co-benefits with climate change at the forefront. And we're really starting to learn a lot more about some of the carbon storage and adaptation benefits that the region's natural environment provides. And so Metro Vancouver worked with a consultant to develop a carbon storage inventory. Part of that work found is that there's millions of tons of carbon that is stored in sort of vegetation and soil within the Metro Vancouver region. And so we can look at our urban forests, which is essentially the trees in our urban backyards, in our parks, as storing approximately 8 million tons of carbon. Some of the more extensive swaths of forest, for example, in the north shore of the region, store around 40 million tons of carbon. We're learning a lot more about the importance of agricultural land in our soils for storing carbon as well. And there's also been an influx of new research, even in this region, on the importance of coastal ecosystems for storing carbon known as blue carbon. So carbon that's stored in some of our coastal ecosystems, such as our seagrasses and our coastal marshes. And there's tremendous carbon storage value here, but these ecosystems are also providing tremendous adaptation benefits by cooling down our urban environments, by absorbing floodwaters, protecting our coastal ecosystems from sea level rise, etc. one of the other major health and or co-benefits is health and well-being. And so there's been certainly been an influx recently sort of outlining how important green spaces are, parks are for our mental and physical health. And this type of co-benefit has certainly been underscored during the current pandemic. Even at the regional level, we know that our regional parks received sort of a surge in visitation during the early months of the pandemic compared to previous years. And so we're really starting to learn more and more about how vitally important these areas are for our health and well-being, and as well as just our general livability as residents of this region. So those are some of the opportunities associated with sort of nature-based solutions and nature and ecosystems as a focus for climate action. But it is also important to recognize that there are some inherent challenges that our region's natural environment is facing. And we're starting to learn a little bit more about these challenges. And one of these challenges is the loss of sensitive and modified ecosystems across the region. So the sensitive ecosystems tend to be ecologically rare, important for biodiversity, sort of larger scale ecosystems. Modified ecosystems tend to be a little bit younger than sensitive ecosystems. In some cases, they're in more of a disturbed, maybe more of an urban environment, but nonetheless still important for biodiversity. And one thing we've been able to do is really track where these ecosystems are across the region over time. And so Metro Vancouver developed a sensitive ecosystem inventory to identify the presence of these ecosystems, first of all, and then secondly, to sort of chart how those ecosystems are shifting over time. And we use sort of a provincial standardized methodology to develop an inventory for ecosystems that are considered sensitive or modified. And here's really where the challenge comes in, is that from the initial time period of the study from 2009 to 2014, we found that we lost around 1,600 hectares of sensitive and modified ecosystems within that 5-year period when we started tracking the presence of these ecosystems. And so for context, that's the equivalent of about 4 Stanley Parks worth of sensitive and modified ecosystems just over that 5-year span. And this map is sort of showing where most of that loss occurred. The red, it sort of denotes where the sensitive ecosystems were lost, and the yellow denotes where more of the modified ecosystems were lost. And this is certainly an inherent challenge with a growing region, a region that's growing by about 35,000 residents per year. And it's a trend that we're continuing to monitor. Here are some of the key drivers of that loss. The majority of this loss is occurring from logging activities, some of which is within our academic research forests, and some of that is sort of commercial logging practices. Some of that landscape is simply cleared or mowed with no sort of ultimate land use determined. Some of that loss is due to transition into more of an agricultural landscape. We're certainly losing some of those ecosystems as a result of residential development and transportation and communication infrastructure and utilities, as well as other causes. So that's one of the fundamental challenges associated with nature and ecosystems and relying on those as a climate change solution in this region, is that the nature and ecosystems within this region are already under threat from a variety of challenges. So one is just primarily the loss of those ecosystems, but a second impact is the role of climate change and how that's starting to affect our ecosystems. And in 2016, Metro Vancouver worked with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium to develop a set of projections that will lay out how our climate is expected to change by the year 2050 and the year 2080. And the results of this report show that we're expected to see warmer temperatures, we're expected to see a decrease in snowpack, wetter winters and drier summers, certainly more intense extreme rainfall events with more of that rainfall falling in sort of pulse precipitation event periods, and additional challenges such as sea level rise. And I think it's important to note that these climate change projections have relevance not only for the communities that we have here in the region and the effects on people, but also for the region's nature and ecosystems. So in light of the opportunities that have been identified thus far in terms of why nature-based solutions are an important part of the climate change conversation. And in light of some of the challenges that those same ecosystems are facing within this region, we decided to put forth some proposed long-term goals. And these goals are meant to basically describe an end state by the year 2050 and really help to frame some of the other fundamental ideas that we put forward as part of this discussion paper. And so the first goal was that nature and ecosystems are resilient, they're protected, they're maintained, restored, and connected in order to maximize the ecosystem services they provide across the region. And the second goal that we put forward is that nature-based solutions that support biodiversity are actually prioritized in the region's response to climate change. And so we really wanted to make sure that that biodiversity component was not lost in the climate conversation. Solutions that are beneficial from a climate change perspective are also beneficial for biodiversity. We also identified some of the current actions that are already occurring in the region. And so the intent of this section of the discussion paper was not to create an exhaustive list of all the actions that our member jurisdictions are taking, for example, but rather just to highlight some of the innovative approaches that are already happening so we can start to build on some of that work. And so I'll just highlight a few for relevance here. For example, committing to nature-based solutions to support climate change goals, which is happening across multiple municipalities here in the region. Implementing new forest management practices to actually adapt to climate change and enhance carbon storage, and the provincial government is certainly making some headway in this regard. Planting and restoring seagrass in appropriate locations to meet multiple objectives, including restoring biodiversity, protecting our shorelines, and also as a carbon storage solution. And we're certainly starting to see more of that happening here in this region. We also want to highlight some example actions that are being taken outside of the region across Canada as well as internationally. And so, for example, we're seeing investments in green infrastructure as a specific flood management approach at really large scales. You can see that through, for example, the sponge city approach in China and other examples across other cities. We're seeing restoration of coastal ecosystems, and we're seeing watershed connections being redrawn to provide habitat, protect important areas from flooding, and to improve overall ecological health. And that's happening in multiple locations across the world. We're also seeing where climate change fits into protected area and wildlife corridor planning to really identify how species and their movements and their migration patterns might shift as a result of a changing climate. And so there's really been a lot of research in this area in the past several years, both within Canada and internationally as well. So those are just highlighting some of the innovative approaches that we've seen, and there's, again, there are many more of those types of actions in the discussion paper itself, and I would encourage you to take a look to see some of the other examples that we have included in the paper. But this sort of leads us to the creation of big ideas, and this is really where we wanted to test how some of these ideas land, specifically in the Bowen Island context. And these big ideas are meant to be foundational in nature. They're meant to be supportive of some of those actions that I just mentioned, and really move the needle from both a carbon storage perspective as well as a resilience and adaptation perspective. And so the first big idea is to accelerate and expand the restoration and protection of natural areas and urban ecosystems. And this is not a new or novel idea, and there's certainly work being done across the region in this regard. But I think what we're recognizing here is that we really need to ramp those efforts up. And we tried to illustrate what that could look like through the development of a few separate sub-targets. So, for example, we could be protecting 50% of the land base in the region. So right now, across the Metro Vancouver region, approximately 40% of the land base is protected by some sort of federal, provincial, regional, or local park or protected area. And by bumping that up to 50% would actually align with the Nature Needs Half initiative and sort of really move the needle from a protection standpoint. So that's one sort of aspirational target that we could consider. Another one is to reverse the loss of the region's sensitive ecosystem. So on some of the previous slides, I showed how those trends are looking, at least from the 2009 to 2014 period. We unfortunately don't have the latest results of the inventory update quite yet, but some of the trends we're seeing are quite staggering in terms of loss. And so it would be really wonderful if we could try and reverse that loss and actually track, now that we can track where those ecosystems are occurring, try and reverse that trend that we're seeing and actually restore some of those ecosystems back. We could also increase urban tree canopy to 40%. So in this instance, we're referring to the urban tree canopy within the urban containment boundary across the region. The current levels of tree canopy is 32%, and so this would involve bumping that up to an 8% increase across the region within that urban containment boundary. So that's big idea one, which is really focused on protecting and restoring the ecosystems that we do have left. And the second idea is really about how can we connect those restored ecosystems, those protected ecosystems together in order to maximize ecosystem services. So here we're putting forward an idea to connect a regional green infrastructure network of natural areas, urban ecosystems, and wildlife corridors. Again, not only to maximize ecosystem services for the communities across the region, but also when we're thinking about species migration and how species need to move in the context of a changing climate. Do we have connected ecosystems across the region and connected components of green infrastructure? And this leads us to the third big idea, which is to integrate natural assets into conventional asset management and decision-making processes. And this is certainly a concept that's gaining traction at the local level all across Canada with groups like the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. I know that in the Bowen Island context, this is a topic of conversation that's also being considered as well. And I think when we're thinking about the year 2050, it would be really great if we recognize the inherent value, but also the ecosystem service value that the region's ecosystems are providing, and to be able to incorporate some of those functions into our decision-making processes across the region. And so those are the three fundamental big ideas that we've put forward in the paper. And I do think in looking at some of the documents within Bowen Island's for example, park acquisition strategy or park strategy, as well as the climate action strategy, I do think there's some nice alignment simply in terms of ecosystem protection and acquisition, creating a greenways network, and putting together a bit of a natural assets inventory. So I'm hopeful that with some of the directions we've put forward with those big ideas, there is some alignment in terms of the Bowen Island context. And sort of speaking to David's earlier point, I think we also recognize that we need to really work together if we're to meet some of these really ambitious milestones. And not one single entity can be responsible for implementing all of the actions and the concepts and ideas that we've put forward in the discussion paper. And so I think that's really where a lot of the value of this type of conversation comes into play, is we really need to work together to touch base on the sort of general direction that we'd like to go, and to find out what actions can actually be implemented by all of these different agencies. And so I think that it would be really great to touch base with this audience following the presentation to talk about how we might be able to do that. In terms of feedback, we're happy to receive any immediate feedback you have following this presentation as part of the next conversation. You can also send us your feedback towards the end of this year if you prefer to do so at a later date. And you can do that through our various Climate 2050 channels, through the email address, the website, and I believe David is also sending a link to the questionnaire as well. So thanks very much. It's great to be here as part of this conversation to engage in the next part of the event, which is actually discussing how some of these concepts land from a Bowen Island perspective. And so I might just leave this slide up. I really want to test out if we have the right goals, if some of the actions that you've noted here really apply to this region or not, or specifically to Bowen Island. Any thoughts you might have on the big ideas and some of the general major directions that we're thinking of going on as part of this process. And finally, if we missed anything. So I might just leave it here and turn it back over to you, Bonnie and David.
Well, thank you very much, Edward. Really appreciate that. And I think there's lots to think about and work from. So what we're doing now is we're just asking for everybody's thoughts, ideas, questions, issues, Any questions of clarification? Do you need to understand something a little bit more, or do you have some additional ideas, things that are great, things that aren't so great, things that might be missing? So please use your hand function, put up your hand, and I will ask you to speak.
I just wanted to add too, I know there's one participant that doesn't have a microphone, so I will be looking at the chat if anybody wants to put anything in the chat. And I just wanted to reiterate for those who joined late that this is being recorded, this session. So I just wanted everybody to know that. We really like people to have their cameras on because we want to make it personable. However, if you're not comfortable with that, then understand your cameras might be turned off, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bonnie. Maureen, I see that you have your hand up, so go ahead, please. You need to unmute yourself, Maureen. I can see your mic's still muted. Maureen, I can see your mic is still muted. Here you are.
Okay, sorry about that. I was saying, thank you for the presentation so far. I'm Maureen Nicholson. I'm the councillor who serves on the Metro Parks Committee, and you touched on the idea of nature needs half. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more, because I think it's an incredibly powerful metaphor and an incredibly powerful goal.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Nature Needs Half is a global initiative, or a sort of a global concept that's really sort of gained traction. And the idea is that we need to be protecting 50% of our land base and have that completely reserved towards natural ecosystems and natural ecosystem function. And so in some ways, I think it's an aspirational target for jurisdictions across the world to really try and hang their hat on and really try and strive for. And often cases, I think it's really difficult, particularly in urban environments, to actually achieve something like a 50% protection rate. But in the context of this region, if we're already at 40%, I think it's a really interesting opportunity to try and see if we can get that sort of 10% of additional protection, and to try and align with this global initiative to seek to protect 50% of the terrestrial ecosystems.
Thank you. I'm just going to add a little bit to that, or add another question perhaps. I mean, 50%, I love as Maureen said, like the idea of nature needs half is really, it's a strong statement. For Bowen, we already have, if you have a look, look at Bowen from above, more than half of it is protected. So, we don't want to obviously lose more, but it would be lovely if some areas of Bowen that actually look like they're protected but aren't could be included in this move towards protecting half of the region. And I'm thinking of our crown lands, which are right now could be logged. There's issues around using motorized vehicles on them, and we don't have that control to be able to do it either on Bowen or regionally. So to have that slide into Metro Vancouver's goal, I think might be quite useful.
That's great. Thanks, David.
Thanks. Other questions, please?
Just wanted to reiterate, if everybody can put their little hand up, icon, it would be easier to see. It's hard to see everybody all at once. Thank you. That's awesome.
I don't see any other hands right now. I'm going to ask another one.
Susan has her hand up, David.
Okay, I'm not seeing it. Why am I not seeing it?
Yeah, Susan, and then Will.
Okay, great.
I just had a question about where you were mentioning how much is lost to different types of activities, and you had 19% lost to agriculture. And I want some clarification, because in the groups that I work with, we're looking at agriculture as a way to regenerate soil. I mean, there are different approaches to agriculture, and some may actually help store carbon. I mean, but it's a trade-off. I guess I'd like to hear the nuance from you, what you mean. Are we supposed to not do agriculture then? We're trying to increase that for our food resilience on the island, for instance.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I don't think the intention of that slide was to say that you know, all of those causes of loss are things we need to be avoiding. And I think it's really just speaks to the transition of some of those landscapes where they may not meet the criteria of a sensitive or modified ecosystem, but they may still be important ecosystems nonetheless. And we do know that there is a really strong relationship between agricultural lands and natural ecosystems and carbon storage that are still providing that function. And so I think you raised a great point that we need to be careful about how we sort of talk about that nuance, and we know how important agricultural lands are to this region. And so I think when we're talking about that loss, we just need to be careful about that nuance, and that we're talking about ecosystems that are being sort of dropped out of the inventory or no longer meet the qualifications, but it doesn't mean that those ecosystems are now derelict or unusable. And in many cases, those ecosystems that aren't sensitive are still quite highly functional.
If this is John, also from Metro Vancouver, if I can add to what Edward was saying. So there's also a engagement being done on an agriculture discussion paper, and that's also on the website for Climate 2050. And in there, it talks about the critical need to make sure that we're protecting our agricultural lands across the region. So certainly, I think the broad direction that Climate 2050 is looking for is to ensure that we maintain our agricultural lands, both for their resilience and for their economic benefits and for their food security benefits. So I think, yeah, as Edward said, I think it's just a matter of we'll adjust sort of how we describe that. Thanks, Susan.
Bonnie, I'm for some reason I'm not seeing any hands.
Okay, I'll read them out to you. I think Will was next.
Okay, great. Will, please.
Okay. First of all, I'll just identify myself. I'm the chair of Bowen's Environment and Climate Action Advisory Committee, and I'd like to say what a magnificent document you've put together. It's very encouraging and inspiring. So thank you for that. So one of the things I really liked was the talk about maintaining forest and forest cover. And from the Bowen point of view, looking at that map that you have showing urban forest and the northern forest, and I noticed Bowen's sitting there quietly off to the side with no recognition of the fact that we're mostly forest. And I think we're making a significant contribution to Metro Vancouver by being that. So I'd love to see that as something that was emphasized just from the Bowen Island point of view. The other thing is we have some fairly significant eelgrass habitat in the bays around Bowen. So I'd love to see some purple dots in some of the bays on Bowen. And you probably already know that there's a strong initiative for planting more eelgrass, restoration of eelgrass around Bowen. So that's one thing. I think I'm going to. I've got a number of things that I think I'll add to your feedback form. But again, I really applaud the great work that's been done, that you folks have done.
Thanks very much, Will. I appreciate the feedback, and I might just respond by just clarifying that diagram that you're referring to in relation to carbon storage is a very simplified graphic, and so it's not detailing where all the carbon stores are in the region, and we do have a very complex GIS data set that would detail some of those ecosystems you identified on Bowen. It was sort of meant to be a sort of very simplified infographic just identifying the ecosystems writ large, and so we tried to make it a bit spatial, but valid point. So thanks for raising that, and for raising some of the great initiatives that are happening on Bowen that we might want to look into. So thank you.
If I could just jump in, David, I know that Michael Penny did have his hand raised, but I just wanted to read out, if I could, something in the chat from Mark, because he doesn't have a microphone. Mark says, how about creating a wetland below the sewage treatment plant to treat the effluent? The treatment plant provides secondary treatment that goes directly into Howe Sound. The effluent is actually quite clean. And then in brackets, I monitored the treatment plant at Seymour Bay for a spell. It was awesome. So you have some knowledge as it is. So I have some knowledge as it is the same, except for microbes, notably E. coli. Would being filtered through a wetland count as tertiary treatment? A wetland would provide storm surge sea level rise protection to our infrastructure, provide valuable habitat for birds, amphibians, and cool plants, and sequester carbon. Would there be funding opportunities? So that's there's a few questions in there for Edward or for John. And then I think Michael Penny has a question after your answer.
This is John. Maybe I can try to answer that question. And I'll admit I'm not 100% sure whether Bowen falls under the same liquid waste management as the sort of the rest of Metro Vancouver. No, okay, I didn't think so.
It hasn't.
Okay, I didn't think so. I mean, yeah, I think I would end up deferring to the folks in our liquid waste department on that question. I just don't know whether that would be possible. I mean, I certainly think if it is possible, that's one that should be explored. I mean, as Edward was saying, one of the things that I think we're discovering is that more of this green infrastructure is really helpful. It's cost effective. It can support all kinds of other ecosystem benefits. So any opportunities to put that in place where it's going to be effective and it's going to serve the right function, I think we definitely want to be looking at that. So that's one that we can maybe ask our liquid waste department.
Yeah, I might just add to that. I think there's a couple of concepts that they're almost a hybrid between different issue areas with Climate 2050, and this might be one of those where it's partly nature and ecosystems, it's also partly infrastructure related, and so this might be one for us to an idea for us to flag as to sort of how we allude to that type of concept. I might also just say that I think in general, in terms of the concept of a wetland providing that sort of ecosystem service or function, that really ties into that third big idea around natural asset management. And so you may have a wastewater treatment plant on your asset or your budget sheet at the local level. If a wetland is providing that same function, can we recognize that through formal budget processes, through formal asset management strategies, and through formal decision making? And so I think conceptually, I think the idea really does align with some of the concepts we're putting forward here.
Thanks, Edward. Bonnie, you've got Michael next.
Michael, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. First, just very specific comment. People have already alluded to the forest cover in Bowen, and every so often there is a bit of a panic when the rumor gets out that logging is going to take place. So I just make the comment that your report makes it clear to me that it's absolutely essential that logging not take place. Understand that it's a provincial government responsibility, but whatever you can do, liaison is good. And then I have another question, which may be very broad, but I'm on the Advisory Planning Commission for Bowen Island. So in terms of making land use planning decisions, how can we be guided by your reports and by your work?
Yeah, that's a great point about the logging, and it is one of the sort of thornier issues when it comes to jurisdictional issues. In terms of a sort of land use planning perspective, I'm also involved in the regional growth strategy update process as part of our regional planning team here. One of the things that we're trying to do whenever possible is to try and align some of the directions that we put forward here as part of this discussion paper, and to see where that fits into the update of our regional growth strategy, which is essentially our almost like the equivalent of our official community plan for the region, and to really try and find some of those synergies. So whether that's incorporating something like the aspirational tree canopy target and sort of requesting for feedback on how that's implemented into land use plans, I think there's a lot of different areas of flexibility where we can sort of consider how some of these concepts might actually fit into something like a regional growth strategy or into local planning initiatives. And that's certainly something that we're trying to seek alignment on as we develop that process sort of in parallel.
And if I can just add, part of the goal with the whole Climate 2050 process is to try to address how the region as a whole, and not any one specific government agency, how the whole region can move to being carbon neutral and resilient over the next 30 years. So we know that Metro Vancouver, we have certain specific responsibilities, certain authorities, some unique to our jurisdiction, but obviously, you know, we're not, as you said, we're gonna have a hard time dealing with logging issues that are provincial. And so one of the things that we're expecting will be included as part of Climate 2050 is a series of effectively advocacy actions to other levels of government, so that we're hoping to identify what is the pathway that gets us to carbon neutral and gets us to being a resilient region. And a lot of those will include actions that we're going to be pushing the province or the federal government or you know, in some cases local municipalities to use their powers to address. So it's, even though Metro Vancouver doesn't have that authority, we want to make sure that we know what are the issues and so that we can be using what abilities we have to push other governments to the other governments that have the specific responsibility to sort of do their part as well.
And I might just also follow up, you know, on sort of the land use planning perspective. Something that we did caveat in the discussion paper is that these are very ambitious targets and directions, and we do have to address the reality that we are living in the context of a very constrained land base, where there are a lot of different demands on land use. So when we're thinking about enhancing our tree canopy cover or restoring ecosystems or protecting ecosystems, that's going to be sort of a more nuanced and collaborative approach with the various land use planning happening at the regional level and also at the local level. And I think we recognize that there's a lot more coordination to do between those two processes, particularly as we start to lay out some of the more concrete actions as part of the roadmap, which is the next step.
Great, thank you. Bonnie, I don't know why I'm not seeing any hands at all on my screen.
No, I don't see any hands. If I may be so bold, if I could just jump in with a question or comment.
Ruth put her hand up.
Oh, Susan. Susan has her hand up again. Susan.
And Ruth, did you see Ruth's hand?
Oh.
Ruth Simons?
Yes, Ruth as well, yeah.
So Susan first.
Susan, you're muted. You're muted, Susan.
I thought I unmuted, but I muted. It has to do with trees. We all love our trees. Bowen Island, for instance, that I am aware of, hasn't had a policy related to cutting trees and saving trees. So, but it leads me to think, is one of the offers from Metro Van, when you're collaborating and writing this beautiful plan, to provide some kinds of policy possibilities. So for instance, if we knew what the best tree policies were for a municipality to consider adopting, that would be great to have a sort of boilerplate available. So maybe there'd be a menu of policies for some of these initiatives that you're looking at.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. I think you've really hit the nail on the head here. I think, you know, especially in terms of identifying what the Metro role is, I think providing data, providing templates that can help municipalities or member jurisdictions at the local level actually achieve this sort of regional vision is certainly a role that we can provide. And from a trees perspective, we do have one initiative known as the Urban Forest Climate Adaptation Initiative, which sort of lays out a framework for the trees that are most likely to survive under future climate change conditions across the region, based on the climate change we're expected. But we have heard from a number of member jurisdictions that it would be great if we had some sort of best practices document as it relates to zoning and tree bylaws for enhancing tree canopy at the local level. And that's something that we're certainly looking into. And I think that could be something that's rolled right up into something like a roadmap for this particular issue area, but also just a standalone deliverable that helps municipalities meet some of the ambitious targets we've laid out and sort of really aligns with our knowledge sharing and convening role here at Metro Vancouver.
I just want to comment on that, Edward. Thank you very much. And Susan, that was a great question. Like Metro Vancouver is such a diverse number of municipalities and local governments where you have folks like Vancouver who have all kinds of their own planning staff and are pretty protective about what they do. And then you've got little places like Bowen Island who don't really have the time and the resources to do a lot of the things that are needed. And to provide these kinds of templates for some of the smaller organizations, you know, us and Lions Bay and several of the other smaller groups, it would be extremely helpful. So thanks. That was a great question, Susan, and good answer. Thanks, Edward. And I think Ruth has had her hand up. Ruth?
Hi, hi everyone, and thanks for taking my question. I'm actually not on Bowen Island, but I got married there, if that counts. And so I do live in Metro area in Lions Bay. So I just wanted to mention that I'm really looking forward to reading the report. I'm also leading the UNESCO Biosphere Region Initiative, which we've just learned about yesterday, that the Canadian Commission for UNESCO has formally endorsed our nominations. So it's going forward to Paris.
Oh, that's really good.
And we should be designated this time next year. But really the objectives that you've stated there, the goals are very much aligned with the objectives of biosphere reserves. The Howe Sound region, which includes a portion of, obviously, of Metro Vancouver from, it's a watershed, so Cypress Creek in West Vancouver, across to Gibsons and so on, and up just south of Whistler. 42% of the terrestrial area there is protected. I think the objectives of biosphere reserves, which is to increase, demonstrate progress towards biodiversity conservation, having a 50% goal would be wonderful. So I think the biosphere can also support sort of documenting of best practices and sharing that through the Howe Sound Community Forum. But my question is two things. The federal government is looking at other effectively conserved management areas, OECMs. And I was wondering if you connect to the definitions of OECMs, so that when communities are looking at how to conserve and protect, they're aligned. And the second part is when we were looking at how much area is protected in the region, UNESCO takes a serious look at how the lands are managed around those protected areas. And that can make the difference between an effective protected area or not. So I just wondered if that was a consideration as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that great feedback. I think that those are two very key points that we could be looking into as we develop the next stage and going into the roadmaps. You know, I think the intention behind the discussion paper is to sort of seed this large idea, but when it comes to actually implementing it and how we do it and what sort of templates we look at and what other models are available, that's sort of really digging into the next phase. So thank you very much for flagging those resources. I've written them down here, and I think we'll certainly look into those as we move on to the next stage. And I also just think your original point about the UNESCO biosphere is sort of really just sort of underscoring that this is a very unique region, and there is just sort of this underlying tremendous inherent spiritual and cultural importance to these areas, and that's something that, you know, we need to make sure is not lost as part of this conversation, is that this is just sort of a truly special region when it comes to the natural environment.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. Phil Gregory, looks like David, that you want to say something.
Great, thanks, Phil.
Okay, well, thank you for your presentation. And I just wanted to share with you one of the things that a group of
And can you speak up a little, please, Phil? We can just hear you.
Can you hear me better?
Much better.
Okay. So one of the things that a group of us are trying to do here on Bowen is to promote the idea of a cosmetic pesticide ban for Bowen. As you're no doubt aware, these toxic chemicals can have very bad effects on the ecology, and of course we recognize that Metro Vancouver has long ago adopted a cosmetic pesticide ban. But it's an educational process that's required here. So if you had some member of your team that of Metro Vancouver that would make a very good speaker on the topic and share lessons learned, and we could perhaps organize another climate conversation to help with that educational process here on Bowen.
I can try to address that. So just to quickly check, you mentioned that there is already a cosmetic pesticide ban. Is that done through Metro Vancouver, or I hadn't heard of that as one that Metro Vancouver had put in place?
No, I believe it
yes,
would be municipalities.
Okay.
Richmond has one.
It's altogether 40 municipalities
Okay.
already have these cosmetic pesticide ban. In fact, almost all of the southern Gulf Islands are covered because they fall under because they're unincorporated, they fall under the Greater Capital District, I think it's called. And so they have a cosmetic pesticide ban. And so most of the southern Gulf Islands are covered by that ban, but we are incorporated, so we're not covered by anybody.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of the last municipality, probably not the only, but one of the last municipalities that's not protected by a cosmetic pesticide ban. And we just recently did a survey, some encouraging support, all right, but there was also an indication that there were many people that still thought that cosmetic pesticide, the vast majority were safe and not a big problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking to change that viewpoint.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the idea of a cosmetic pesticide ban would be one that could be explored as part of the development of these plans, particularly around its sort of air quality effects and how it can have an impact on public health. And I think that's very good input that we can take away and see if there's some exploration that can be done around what the opportunity is there. Is it something that we could develop, sort of a template bylaw that could be implemented for some of the municipalities? Again, sort of as David was saying, that for some of the smaller municipalities that are maybe less able to develop some of these on their own, this is something that Metro Vancouver could certainly look at. As for the question around who could come in as an educational speaker, I'll admit I'm less sure on that. That's one I can take away and maybe try to reach out to some of our colleagues at the other municipalities and see if they might know who would be the right contact.
And I'd just like to add a little bit here. And Phil, this is really on my list of things to do, and I haven't done it yet. So, and I know some contacts to work with, and I know I should be.
Perhaps I'm speaking to you, David, through Edward.
Yeah, sure. Okay, do we have more questions? Do you see any other hands?
I don't see, is there anybody that has anything they'd like to add, anything in the realm of nature or ecosystems or anything that was presented?
While people are thinking, I could add another one. I was, that map that looked at the damage, the loss of sensitive ecosystems. There was a bunch of it on Bowen Island, which there were some comments online or in our chat we were not happy to see. But to deal with that, to restore sensitive ecosystems, how could we move forward on that on a regional scale? Like I can't quite imagine how that could be worked on collaboratively. Can you help us understand a little bit about how that might work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly one of the more ambitious and challenging propositions is to sort of try and bring back the sort of amount of acreage of ecosystems that we've lost. And I think it may be more feasible for some ecosystems than others. And so I think that's probably something that will be fleshed out through the development of the roadmap. But for example, whether that is tree plantings and afforestation, or whether that's more of a coastal ecosystem, I think that really depends on sort of each municipality and where the opportunities are for restoration. I don't think it's something we fleshed out completely to say we know exactly how that restoration is going to happen. But I think what we're really getting at with that particular piece is that since 2009, we know we've lost 1,600 hectares, and that's, you can't measure what you can't, you can't manage what you can't measure. And so now that we have measured it, that does provide a useful yardstick for us to think about actually gaining some of those ecosystems back. So it's one thing to protect existing ecosystems, but it's quite another to try and restore ecosystems where possible. And so that one is probably going to be really challenging, and it's probably one of the more ambitious targets. But to get back to, it's essentially to get back to 2009 levels for sensitive ecosystems. So almost thinking about how you would for GHG emissions, where you're trying to get back to a certain point in time. We're kind of taking that same concept to say, can we get back to the level of sensitive ecosystems that we had in 2009, since we know how many have been lost since then. So a great point, that it's something that we really need to think carefully about where those opportunities actually are across the region. And it may be quite variable depending on the ecosystem type within the inventory.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Edward. I see we've got a couple of comments on the chat from Mark, work out a deal with the owner when they apply to rezone, and from Mikhail, collect funds for development and use them to purchase, preserve areas, habitat and ecosystem banking. So good.
And I think, sorry, if I can maybe just add to the point there about the funds for development. I think that's obviously where a lot of the challenge comes down to, is finding a way to get those funds available through, the various mechanisms that are possible to make these purchases. I mean, that's going to be, I think, as Edward said, I mean, that's probably the big challenging part, is finding the funds to turn these various ecosystems into protected ecosystems. And I think any and all ideas would be very welcome there.
I might just, sorry, Bonnie. I might just add to that, I attended an international conference earlier this summer called the Nature-Based Solutions Dialogue that was hosted in Europe. And there was an entire session on funding and finance. And I just thought one of the interesting takeaways from that conference was that in some cases, when you sort of bridge sort of ecosystem restoration with climate change goals and climate change outcomes, and you sort of present the problem and the solution in that regard, and really try and tie those two concepts together, there may actually be more funding opportunities available. So I think that's certainly something we can consider when we get into the finer details of the roadmap. But potentially using the importance of these ecosystems from a climate change perspective as a mechanism for acquiring funding is something we could also be looking at as well.
Thank you. David, I think Phil, someone in,
Well, good.
Actually, my wife Jackie wants
With
to
me.
say something.
Jackie, good, thank you.
I'm wondering, Edward and John, if you're familiar with regenerative agriculture and how much it can actually sequester, how much carbon it can actually sequester in the soil, plus is extremely restorative to ecosystems.
Yes, we are aware of that. And that's one of under the big ideas that are described in our the agriculture discussion paper. More transition towards regenerative agriculture is one that we highlighted for, as you say, for the ecosystem benefits, for the carbon storage. I mean, we've been hearing from some academics that there is an open debate about the level of storage that is possible, but I think even if that storage is less than we'd hoped, I think the ecosystem benefits and the ability to sort of restore, restore the soil to make it more productive, make the agricultural operations more productive. I think there's a lot of benefit there, and that's one that we're certainly looking at. I'm in about 2 hours, I'm presenting to the Delta Agricultural Advisory Committee, and I'm sure that'll be one of the topics that we discuss is around regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, and I might just follow up on that as well, and John, feel free to step in if I've mischaracterized this. But I think one of the advantages of Climate 2050 and sort of the direction that we're taking it is that we see this as a somewhat dynamic document that can be updated over time as new research comes to the fore. And I think from a nature and ecosystems perspective, two of those areas are probably around soil carbon storage and blue carbon storage in seagrasses and in coastal salt marshes. And we recognize that these, in some cases, are emerging research areas where we may not have consensus on their carbon storage value or their applicability for the region. But I think it's great to be aware of them, to flag them, and it's certainly something that we hope that we can update as the research becomes more concrete and the research advances on those topics.
Great, thank you very much. I see that Maureen has her hand up.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. The first one is what do you think is most important for Bowen Islanders to take away from this report? So that's the first.
That's a great question. So if I'm going to let Edward take that away on the nature and ecosystem side, but I think what I would say, if I can take it up sort of to the whole sort of Climate 2050 strategy, I think what I want people to take away is that there are solutions available. It's going to require everyone to be working together and sort of adopting the same policies at the municipal level, at the regional level, the provincial level, the federal level. And that's hard. But I think there's so many benefits to trying to address climate change, right? In terms of what it might mean for transportation options, what it means for air quality, what it means for ecosystem protections. And so I guess my main takeaway is that we think we can do this, and I think that Metro Vancouver is the right region to be doing this, and these ideas can then get sort of exported elsewhere and adopted elsewhere. So I guess maybe I would hope that people take away that there's a possible solution here, that we can solve this problem, I think is my main takeaway. It's a hopeful one.
Yeah, and I think my thinking on that is just that, yes, we need to do, to fundamentally draw down our emissions, and we need to get off fossil fuels, and we need to do these sort of fundamental actions to achieve a carbon neutral region. But I think one of my main takeaways is just this idea of co-benefits, and the idea that nature and ecosystems, while being inherent climate solutions and that they're storing carbon and helping us adapt to the impacts of climate change, they're also providing these tremendous co-benefits. So they're really, in many cases, they're sort of no regrets approaches. And so I think we can kind of leverage that climate argument to do policies and actions that may have benefits for biodiversity and other co-benefits for human health and well-being on their own. And I think that's really where the true value of nature and ecosystems comes through in this paper, is that they can help us store carbon, they can help us adapt to a changing climate, and they also provide these wonderful co-benefits. And so I think it's just, in many cases, it's just such a wonderful climate change solution. And in the context of Bowen Island, it is an island that does have a great sort of bounty of natural resources already. And those resources are providing ecosystem services, are providing benefits, and really communicating the value of that natural environment, I think is really important in terms of the role for Bowen Island.
Okay. So when you've finished with your discussions and all the different municipalities, I know that in the past with some reports, the process has been to compile the feedback, to develop various drafts, and to, sorry, my cat wants to be part of this conversation, and then to see the way in which individual municipalities might set out what their goals are and how they fit in within the larger plan. Is that roughly what you're intending to do this time around? What's the process?
Maybe I can take that question. So where we're at is I think Edward has shown that in one of his earlier slides, that we're in, to some degree, in the idea collection phase. And so we're going to be on both nature and ecosystems, and in 2 weeks we're going to be talking about transportation. We're soliciting ideas from the public and from other stakeholders, and then from there we're going to be bringing to the various committees of Metro Vancouver, primarily the one that David sits on, which is the Climate Action Committee. We're going to be going to that committee with a variety of draft plans. So I'm responsible for one called the Draft Clean Air Plan. Edward is going to be working on the roadmap for nature and ecosystems. And these all very much work together. A lot of the actions will overlap. And the idea is that early in the new year, we'll be bringing those to this Climate Action Committee. And then there'll be an additional round of engagement, because these discussion papers identify a suite of options. And then what we'll be coming back with in the new year is, now here is the actual list. This is what Metro Vancouver is going to do. This is what we want the municipalities to do. This is what we want the feds to do. It's going to be a much more detailed list of how do we draw down our emissions? How do we, remove carbon through natural sources, and how do we become more resilient? So it's going to identify what we think is the pathway to do that. And then there'll be a second round of engagement. And then the idea is that towards the latter half of next year, we'll be then starting to adopt those as like official Metro Vancouver policy, which sort of is adopted by the region as a whole, by the board of Metro Vancouver. And then from there, then it becomes like, now it's actually into the nuts and bolts of implementing it. So, okay, action 2 is around whatever, establishing intensity targets for new buildings. And we'll be setting, then going out and actually just starting to develop those policies, because as is on Bowen Island's climate action strategy, we have Bowen Island and the region have this target for 30%, or sorry, 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's a big thing to do. So like, we don't want to be spending the next 3 years developing this. We want to be developing it, adopting it, and then starting to get those actions in place, because there's a big heavy lift coming, and we need to start working on it.
Okay, thank you. And just one final question. The question was asked earlier about whether regenerative agriculture is part of your thinking at this point. I'm wondering if conservation development is part of your thinking as well. It was discussed a good deal in 2018 on Bowen, and there has been some policy work on it. Does it figure at all in your thinking?
Yeah, and maybe can you just elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by conservation development?
Yeah, but I'm going to turn that over to David to elaborate, because he's been running with it. Go, yeah. David.
Basically, it means clustering when we're looking at rezonings and new development, we're trying to cluster it so that we're saving as much natural habitat as possible, and bringing the homes together rather than a sort of a suburban sprawl type of development, moving people together closer to transportation routes and saving as much land as possible. Just for your information, I have talked to Heather McNell, the head of planning at Metro Vancouver, about this, and we've had some chats, but we haven't sort of got anywhere definitive about it yet. But it's a conversation that's happening in some of the other sort of more rural parts of the region, in the valley sort of area as well. And part of the debate is about rural character. So, you know, the word density doesn't sound good. Clustering sounds better. Rural character sort of sounds like spread. And so that's some of the debate that's been going on. But I have had a conversation with Heather McNell about it. But I'd love to have a bit more of a conversation. It's really important for Bowen Island, because if we continue, if all of the land that's owned on Bowen is just developed in a low density manner, we're going to lose a lot of tree cover, and we're going to have a lot of very poor transportation systems that are just spread out all over the place and impossible to serve through transit. So that's what we're getting at.
Yeah, thanks, David. And you know, I think there's a lot of these types of topic areas that are really sort of crossover topics that could extend into multiple issue areas. And so we actually have a land use and growth management issue area where we have a discussion paper forthcoming on that piece as well. And so I see this type of topic area as certainly being applicable to nature and ecosystems, but also very much applicable to land use and growth management. And so I think that's something we can certainly look into as part of the development of that discussion paper, but also in just sort of seeing where the potential overlap is in terms of how we frame this from a nature and ecosystems discussion, because a lot of these issues are very interrelated, and you know the development policies have a direct implication on the natural environment and vice versa. So thanks for flagging that, and we can certainly look into that and have future conversations about that.
Could I just add to that the nature needs 50%. It sort of feeds into conservation development as well. I mean, yeah, it's the bigger picture, maybe overarching.
Yeah.
Could I also just read a couple of the great comments that have been in the chat box here? Michele, this is a really great idea. Michele, if you don't mind me reading that out, or if you wanted to read it out, would you like me to read? Okay. So Michele says, collect funds for development and use them to purchase or preserve areas, habitat, ecosystem banking, instead of a tree replacement bylaw. Collect funds for each tree removed and use the funds to purchase lands. I'm a big advocate for conservation over restoration. And I really like that concept of, sort of banking and collecting money for native vegetation that is removed, carbon that's removed. I guess my question to Edward or John, do you know anywhere that is looking, any other municipalities within Metro Vancouver that are looking at something, or does any of the tree bylaws that you know of in any of the jurisdictions deal with anything of this sort?
So that's actually something that we're hoping to look at this year. Is we're hoping to do a bit of a research in terms of best practices on things like tree bylaws, and see, what are sort of the most innovative tree bylaws that where the fundamental components can be replicated as sort of a best practice. So certainly something that we're going to be looking into. And I would say in general, I think these are great ideas. And Bonnie, I hope that there's a way we can also just capture some of the chat comments for prosperity afterwards. It'd be great to be able to see these in their entirety. But I think these are ideas that we flagged in the discussion paper as they're going to be important for the implementation of some of these big directions that we've set a course for. And so it's really great to hear some of these suggestions for how we might actually implement that on the ground. And I think that's really a huge part of the next step of the roadmap development is sort of what are some of the concrete actions where we can actually take steps to meet these ambitious goals and targets. So thanks for raising these. That's great. And there's a nice chat, and I will definitely capture this chat and provide that for you. But Susan says that, some people only look at the business case. And I just wanted to share with the participants that the Finance Committee met and we talked about composting at the last, we're looking at a compost on island composting facility. And it was just really refreshing because we talked about the triple bottom line. It was a really encouraging discussion. So
maybe financially there is some implications for the taxpayer, but it was really great to see that the financial folks on this island, our neighbors that are financially focused, our accountants, they are looking at a triple bottom line. So that was really, really great.
Maybe Bonnie, if I can just add to that, something that Metro Vancouver has been implementing, I think maybe over the last 4 or 5 years, is what's called sort of a corporate shadow carbon price. So when Metro Vancouver, which is also responsible for ensuring safe drinking water in the region, again, probably maybe not for Bowen,
Not for us, Pat.
but for the rest of the region. So we deal with also the solid waste and the liquid waste and the drinking water, which involves obviously big infrastructure projects. And so now we have this policy that when we're looking at what are the options for, for a new liquid waste management facility or what have you, we apply it's $150 per ton of carbon dioxide. We apply that to every one of these options to understand which one is going to have to sort of raise up the profile of sort of low carbon options. And just to give you a sense, so the provincial carbon tax is $50, or it's now $50 a ton. And so this is looking at a level like 3 times higher as an internal check, just to make sure that we try to prioritize a low carbon infrastructure when we can build it. So that's an additional approach that can get used.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment on that. I actually saw the analysis that went in. I don't remember the decision, but it was, it was a construction project where looking at that shadow carbon price. Without that shadow carbon price, the cheaper solution would have been, one that would not have taken into account the climate threat that we have. And it's so important. And one thing I was looking at doing, Metro Vancouver, in its map of carbon storage, you can actually, it gets down to the level of detail where we could look at our crown lands, see the actual amount of carbon that is stored by those forests, multiply that by $150 per ton, and you'd probably do better than logging in terms of the value of that land. So there's resources out there that can be used, and I really appreciate Metro's work on that.
And I think that relates, I'm gonna steal Edward's thunder. I think that relates to the third big idea that Edward was talking about, around the idea of bringing the value of those natural assets on a financial level into our sort of municipal and regional accounting mechanisms. I mean, obviously these natural ecosystems have more value than just financial, but at the very least, if we put a dollar value on them, it can change the calculus as to how we use them.
Yeah, and I would also say, it doesn't even have to be financial. It can just simply be a recognition of the service provided and the importance of that in sort of, meeting Bowen Island's climate goals, or, it can be framed in a number of different ways. But I think you hit it exactly, is that we need to sort of accommodate and sort of recognize the essential services that these ecosystems are providing. And if we can put a financial figure on that helps in decision-making processes, that's great.
That's great. There's one other comment in the chat. It's about, I think it's from Mark, who doesn't have a microphone. So about basically the impacts to increase population and the growth strategy, and with compromising nature and ecosystems, I guess, just as more people come. And so that balancing act is tricky. I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit on, more people and more threats. And I mean, that's a really big question, but just maybe you could just shed a little bit of light on how you look at that. Yeah,
and I think a lot of the bones of our regional growth strategy and the growth framework are really effective from a carbon storage perspective. And so the urban containment boundary, which sort of ensures that development is occurring within that boundary, means that we're protecting our conservation and recreation areas and our agricultural areas, so these areas that are providing sort of natural carbon storage. That being said, there's certainly natural areas within our general urban designation that where this can be problematic. And so I think encouraging compact transit-oriented development, which is sort of a key tenets of our regional growth strategy, and encouraging high-density growth, that's all sort of beneficial from a carbon storage perspective. But I think we also need to think about how we can store carbon in these dense urban environments. So how can we bolster tree canopy in these sort of dense urban environments? And Metro Vancouver put together a tree canopy analysis report just last year that was looking at trends over time. And one of the things that we found is that actually in high density urban environments, there's seemingly more opportunity for tree canopy in certain scenarios. And so, we were talking a little bit about best practices before. Maybe that's something that we can also provide as we're thinking about how we maximize and enhance tree canopy in these areas where we expect urban development to occur. But it's certainly a tricky balancing act that we're grappling with as part of the growth strategy update.
And I think maybe if I can add to that, I think probably part of the other side of the table is around, the potential for various sort of educational programs and incentives so that residents and businesses as well are able to reduce the amount of water that they're using. I mean, I think one of the challenges, as you say, is that we are going to be having an increased population within the region as a whole, and that's going to put additional pressure. So if we can reduce the amount of water that is on average used by every resident, then we can accommodate more people without having those draws on the water table or the on the aquifers or what have you.
I want to read one more comment that in our chat box, and this is on wildfire prevention. And I'm not sure if you fellows have much background on this. It's a tricky one for us on Bowen. And the comment is, unfortunately, wildfire prevention is counter to tree canopy goals. Has the fire safe program been considered? Should be the fire smart program. And this is something that we, with longer, hotter summers, we're worried about fire on Bowen. And with the fire smart programs, you end up cutting down a lot of trees that are around buildings. And as Ruth points out, that is counter to the tree canopy goals. Have you had any background on that at all? Or it's something we're working on here, but it's tough.
Yeah, I was actually just looking at the Fire Smart program the other day, and this is a fantastic question because this is an area where there's seemingly trade-offs where if you're enhancing tree canopy around residential areas, but those trees in and around your buildings are, actually increasing the risks to wildfire damage, you're actually not enhancing your resilience. So it's one of those cases where there's sort of an adaptation and resilience concern here around wildfire spread and wildfire damage that can be sort of contrary to this approach. And so I don't have a sort of a silver bullet answer to this issue. I think it also is pretty contextual to the member jurisdictions in the region. I think obviously certain member jurisdictions are going to have higher urban wildfire interface risks than others. And so in some cases, there may need to be more nuance in for example, in around tree bylaws where we can sort of address that trade-off. But it's certainly a great point and certainly not an easy issue to grapple with.
Yeah, thanks. It's a tough one, no question.
I just wanted to add, I know that in riparian areas it's tricky, and I thought the province was working at some guidelines, best practices around how Fire Smart applies in riparian areas. I know that we just did a sort of a Bowen-centric Fire Smart, or we tried to Bowenize a Fire Smart brochure, and so we do talk about riparian areas a little bit, but around wetlands and riparian areas, and just want to try to keep those areas in their natural state and doing what they do, their ecosystem service capabilities intact.
I don't see any. Do you see any more questions, Bonnie? I'm not seeing any either in the.
Will has that question.
It's more just a kind of anecdotal comment about the Fire Smart and trees. We had a Fire Smart seminar on Bowen a year ago or so. And if you look at the background behind me, you'll see that our house is surrounded by big leaf maples. And I asked the expert about that, and he said, don't worry about it. He said deciduous trees like big leaf maples are not a big danger to houses and in a wildfire. And so I think one of the things that I've been seeing is a lot of the fire smart information we're getting is aimed at interior habitats, which are different than what we have on the coast. And so I think we really have to get the research and information about what's about tree species that we have. So and the habitat, which is the rainforest as opposed to the dry forest in the interior. So anyway, just that little sideline. It's more complex, and I think there's a lot more that we can learn.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Yeah, good points. Any other questions, comments? I'm not seeing any more. I think it's time to thank everybody. Look at it.
Oops. David, there's just one comment. Mark has written something in the chat there. Maybe that's a good comment.
Oh yeah, the Fire Smart program recognizes the value in rooftop sprinklers. Are there funding opportunities to help homeowners install these? That'd be another interesting idea for, I guess, lobbying with the provincial government, perhaps, to recognizing that's can be pretty important.
Yeah, and I might just to add on to this conversation, I think this is really important discussion and really important context. And something we found through that tree canopy report that I mentioned is that we also looked at potential planting areas across the region. And one of the things that we found was that there is actually tremendous potential to bolster our tree canopy on private residential property. And so I think this is a really great nuance in that we need to be encouraging tree canopy on private land, but we also need to be considering these factors associated with wildfire so that it's done in an appropriate manner. And so this could be a really key research gap that we explore as we move forward. So yeah, thanks for raising that issue.
Great, yeah, thank you. Any other questions, comments? So seeing none, I just want to pass a few thanks here. I want to thank very much John and Edward for their presentations and Metro Vancouver for the work that's gone into this. I think I speak for everyone saying that this was a really good paper. Susan had a comment that I want to read. Supporting nature and ecosystem services equals a positive future for mitigating climate change instead of gloom and doom. Thanks for the hope. And I think that speaks for a lot of us. I really appreciated what you've done here. I also want to thank Bonnie and Maureen. It was their idea to have this climate conversation. And so thank you, both of you, for doing that. And I want to thank all the participants. I think it was a really interesting discussion. I really appreciated it. And I think we all learned quite a bit. So thank you very much. Really appreciate this. And I'm looking forward to transportation in a couple of weeks. So I think, yeah, Will has his thumbs up. Maureen's clapping. So I think we're done. Thanks so much. Really appreciate this very much.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Great conversation.
Thank you, everybody. The recording will be up tomorrow on the website. And if you have any questions, if you need any links to anything, please send me an email. Happy to disseminate any information you might need.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, folks.
Thanks very much.